Why do we love Star Wars so much? Lightsabers and spaceships? Definitely. But I think we love Star Wars because it's a whole galaxy we can escape into. In this video, we'll slip behind the curtains of canon and fan lore by exploring stories and ideas that might just change how you see the galaxy. So sit back, grab a snack, and let's drift through hyperspace together. And drop a comment letting me know where you're tuning in from. It's always cool seeing where Star Wars fans are watching from across the galaxy. Now, let's begin. So, you probably remember the line from Revenge of the Sith, where Palpatine leans in real close and tells Anakin the story of Darth Plagueis the Wise. He could use the Force to influence the midichlorians to create life. Most people took that as just creepy Sith gossip, Palpatine playing mind games again, trying to turn Anakin. And sure, it worked, but what if it wasn't just manipulation? What if it was a clue? What if Palpatine wasn't just tempting Anakin with a tale? What if he was telling him, without actually telling him, "You wouldn't be here if it weren't for me"? Let's back up for a second. Anakin's mother, Shmi, says there was no father. She just got pregnant somehow. Nobody ever really questioned it too much because, hey, prophecy and all that. The Jedi just sort of shrugged and rolled with it. See, around the time of Anakin's birth, Palpatine was at the height of his apprenticeship with Darth Plagueis. And if the stories are true, they were doing some heavy experimentation with the dark side, pushing into places the Jedi wouldn't dare. Plagueis was obsessed with manipulating life and death, trying to cheat mortality itself. There's a theory, one that's been quietly growing louder over the years, that their experiments actually worked. That somewhere, in some lab or secret Force ritual, they reached out across the stars, bent the midichlorians, and created Anakin. Not born through love or accident or the will of the Force, but as a test, a weapon, an investment. Think about it. Who benefits from the chosen one being born? On the surface, the Jedi think it's them. They think they're getting this supercharged warrior who's going to fix everything. But Palpatine, he's playing the long game. He sits there, in the shadows, watching this miracle boy, already knowing he's going to twist him into exactly what he needs. It's the ultimate long con. Raise the Jedi's golden child right under their noses, feed him just enough attention to make him feel special, but not enough to make him feel loved. And all the while, Palpatine is lurking in the background, the one guy who actually gets him, the only one who says what Anakin's feeling, but doesn't want to admit out loud. The Jedi Council never stood a chance. They raised a weapon thinking it was a savior. They ignored the warning signs because they believed too hard in the prophecy. You ever notice how Palpatine never seems surprised by Anakin's abilities? How he talks about him like a craftsman, talking about his favorite tool? That's not casual admiration. Like watching a plan finally click into place after decades of setup. And if this theory holds any weight, that's exactly what it was. Anakin Skywalker wasn't just a pawn, he was the plan. So now we're left with a pretty wild thought. If Palpatine played a role in Anakin's creation, what does that mean for everything that came after? The fall of the Jedi, the rise of the Sith, and eventually the whole saga of redemption that makes Star Wars what it is. First off, let's talk about the Force itself. The Jedi believed Anakin was the chosen one because of a prophecy, something ancient and mysterious that promised balance. But what if that prophecy was actually a setup? If Palpatine influenced Anakin's birth, then the whole balance idea gets a little murky. Maybe the Force was being pushed and pulled, shaped by Palpatine's ambitions as much as by fate. And then there's Anakin himself, who carried this huge weight on his shoulders without even knowing it. Imagine growing up feeling different, powerful, but out of place, constantly struggling between light and dark, all while being part of a plan you don't even understand. That kind of pressure would crack anyone, even if they didn't have Force powers. Maybe part of why Anakin was so vulnerable to Palpatine's influence was because deep down, he sensed that Palpatine was connected to him in ways no one else was. That bond made Palpatine's manipulation easier, but it also meant that Anakin's fall was almost inevitable. Palpatine didn't have to fight as hard as you might think. The groundwork was already laid. It's like Palpatine was not just the dark side master, but also the architect of the whole tragedy. It's a chilling idea, but it fits the way things unfolded. What's really fascinating is how this theory changes the way we see Luke and even Rey later on. If Anakin was Palpatine's creation, then Luke is more than just a hero. He's the son of someone caught in a battle between destiny and design. And Rey, with her mysterious origins and connection to the Force, might be part of this same tangled web. It's like the saga keeps spinning around this question of how much of it is fate and how much is manipulation. One thing I love about this theory is how it gives a whole new perspective on Palpatine himself. He's always been this mastermind villain, but thinking of him as someone who actually engineered the Chosen One adds a layer of personal obsession. And it makes you wonder about the Sith tradition of passing power from master to apprentice. Palpatine might have taken it a step further, creating an apprentice who was supposed to be the ultimate weapon, built from the ground up for his own purposes. And when that apprentice didn't turn out exactly as planned, the whole galaxy paid the price. Of course, this raises a bunch of questions too. How did the Force react to all of this? Is the Force aware or even capable of resisting someone who's trying to bend it so completely? The saga suggests there's some kind of cosmic balance at play, but maybe the Force is more flexible than we thought. Or maybe it's just waiting for the right moment to reset itself. Whatever the truth is, this theory definitely makes you look at the prequels and sequels in a new light. Palpatine isn't just a puppet master pulling strings from the shadows. He could be the very root of the conflict, the dark seed from which everything grew. And Anakin isn't just the tragic hero who falls and rises. He might be the product of a grand plan, caught between destiny and design. Let's talk about something most people laugh off immediately: Jar Jar Binks being a Sith Lord. Yeah, the idea sounds ridiculous at first, and that's kind of the whole point. Because if it is true, then it's possibly one of the boldest moves in Star Wars history, hiding a villain in plain sight by making him look so annoying, so clumsy, so dumb, that nobody would ever take him seriously. And that's exactly the kind of cover a master manipulator would want. Let's go back to the start. We meet Jar Jar in The Phantom Menace as this goofy, bumbling Gungan who just happens to cross paths with Qui-Gon Jinn and Obi-Wan Kenobi on Naboo. He's clumsy, awkward, constantly making mistakes, but somehow manages to survive situations that should have wiped him out in seconds. Battle droids shooting at him, he dodges them while tripping over his own feet. He gets kicked out of Gungan society for being a walking disaster, yet ends up being accepted again almost instantly after reuniting with Boss Nass. If he's truly this useless, why does everything keep working out for him? That's where the theory starts to get interesting, because when you go back and watch closely, it starts to look a lot less like clumsiness and a lot more like calculated misdirection. The way Jar Jar fights during the Battle of Naboo doesn't look like luck. His movements are chaotic, yeah, but somehow everything lines up. The grenade tosses, the traps, the escapes. It's all too convenient. It's the kind of thing where you laugh at the silliness, but deep down, you feel like something's off. Now, here's where things get weird. After all the chaos, Jar Jar ends up rising in political power almost overnight. He becomes a representative for the Gungans in the Galactic Senate, and somehow, out of all people, he's the one who proposes emergency powers to Chancellor Palpatine. That moment changes everything. It gives Palpatine the legal authority to start the Clone Wars, take control of the Republic, and transform it into the Empire. And it was Jar Jar Binks who handed him that power. It's hard to call that a coincidence. Out of all the experienced senators, the one who steps up is the guy nobody takes seriously. And you can't ignore how Palpatine just sits there calmly while Jar Jar makes that speech. No surprise, no resistance, just quiet approval. It's like it was all part of the script. And if that's true, then Jar Jar wasn't just a pawn. He might have been a collaborator. There's also the fact that George Lucas originally intended Jar Jar to have a much bigger role. Ahmed Best, the actor who played him, hinted in interviews that there was something more planned for the character, but the backlash was so strong after The Phantom Menace that they backed off. Which makes sense. If the audience already hates a character, trying to reveal him as a major villain would have been almost impossible without losing people completely. So, instead, Jar Jar gets pushed to the background in Attack of the Clones and barely shows up in Revenge of the Sith. He's still there, still connected, but quieter, more distant, just enough to be forgotten. But imagine if that was the plan all along. Hide him in plain sight, let the audience dismiss him, and then pull the rug out from under everyone later. It's a classic misdirection move. You don't expect the clown to be holding the knife. That's why people still come back to this theory after all these years. It's weirdly convincing, and the more you think about it, the more it makes you question what you thought you knew about the prequels. And if Jar Jar really was working with Palpatine, or even being manipulated by him as an apprentice or informant, it raises some bigger questions about the Sith's strategy. Maybe they didn't just operate in the shadows, with cloaks and lightning hands. Maybe they used puppets, fools, and distractions to sneak their agenda into the Republic without anyone noticing. That's where we'll go next. Because if Jar Jar was playing the fool to serve the Empire's rise, then there are probably signs we missed. Things hiding in plain sight, quiet decisions, and strange moments that don't make sense. Until you look at them through the lens of this theory, and once you start doing that, it's hard to unsee it. So let's keep pulling this thread, because if Jar Jar was helping Palpatine rise to power, whether he knew it or not, then there's more going on than we first thought. The moment he proposes emergency powers is the moment the Republic really starts crumbling. It doesn't feel like a throwaway plot beat when you look at the broader picture. It feels like the culmination of something that was building for a long time. Jar Jar wasn't just filling in for Padme, he was delivering the final piece of the puzzle. The one thing Palpatine needed that nobody else could have handed him without raising suspicion. Think about the Senate at that time, packed with career politicians, people constantly fighting over control and procedure. Then this Gungan shows up. Friendly, cheerful, seemingly harmless, and people lower their guard. He doesn't come across as threatening, which makes him perfect for slipping dangerous decisions into the conversation. If someone like Bail Organa had proposed giving emergency powers to the Chancellor, there would have been debate, backlash, resistance. But when it's Jar Jar, everyone just kind of goes with it. He's the useful idiot, except he's maybe not so idiotic after all. And then, right after that key moment, he basically disappears from the story. He's still present in the background, sure, but his role becomes nearly silent. That's suspicious. Someone who accidentally handed full control of the Republic to a Sith Lord doesn't just fade into the background, unless it was on purpose. Maybe the job was done. Maybe Palpatine didn't need him anymore. Or maybe he went deeper underground. Some fans even believe Jar Jar might have been watching everything unfold from the shadows, staying close enough to observe, but far enough to avoid being questioned. It wouldn't be the first time the Sith operated like that. Hidden, patient, letting others take the heat while they pulled the strings. What if Jar Jar was the second Sith all along, and Dooku was just another placeholder, until the real plan was ready? It sounds wild, yeah, but when you start lining things up, it holds more water than you'd expect. There's this deleted scene from Attack of the Clones, where Palpatine is walking with Jar Jar, alone in a quiet hallway. It's subtle, but it's there. Why would the Chancellor of the Republic need to have private discussions with a Gungan representative whose main role has supposedly faded out? It's small stuff like that, the body language, the timing, the fact that Palpatine never once criticizes him, even when he completely shifts the fate of the galaxy, that starts to feel like a pattern. There's also this idea that Jar Jar's behavior was all an act from the beginning. If you rewatch The Phantom Menace with this theory in mind, the way he moves and interacts with people starts to feel off. Too exaggerated, like he's trying too hard to be seen as harmless. There are even scenes where it looks like he's using low-key force techniques. His jumps are far beyond normal Gungan ability. He always seems to survive in the middle of chaos, and he shows strange confidence at weird moments, like he knows he's protected. And then there's the eyes. In the rare moments where he isn't goofing around, Jar Jar's expressions go flat. He stares, he listens, he stays quiet. That could just be poor animation direction, or it could be a glimpse of the real face behind the act, a character slipping in and out of the mask he's been wearing. That's what makes this theory so frustrating. You can see the pieces, but the final picture never got finished, like someone ripped the last few pages out of the book and left us guessing. And fans have been guessing for over 2 decades now. But that's part of the fun too. Jar Jar being a Sith Lord is one of those theories that sticks around, because it doesn't totally go away. It lingers. The clues, the missed chances, the strange decisions, it all keeps the idea alive. And honestly, in a galaxy where space wizards shoot lightning and clones fight droids, it wouldn't be the weirdest thing to find out that the most hated character in the prequels was actually the biggest threat the whole time. So here's something that never really sat right with a lot of fans. Mace Windu, one of the strongest Jedi Masters of his time, gets thrown out a window by a guy he had pinned down 2 minutes earlier, and that's supposed to be the end of his story. It doesn't quite add up. This is the same guy who took on armies in the Clone Wars, who mastered a lightsaber form that danced dangerously close to the dark side without losing control. and he gets taken out in one hit and a fall. That always felt off. Let's just walk through what actually happened. Windu confronts Palpatine in Revenge of the Sith, finds out the Chancellor is a Sith Lord, brings backup, and within seconds, it's just him and Sidious. He fights the Dark Lord one-on-one. Mace actually wins that duel. Then Anakin shows up, panics about Padme, and in the blink of an eye, Windu gets his hand cut off and is blasted out of a window by Force lightning. Now, yeah, that sounds like a lethal combo. Lightsaber amputation, Force lightning, then a high-rise plummet through Coruscant traffic. But when you break it down, it's not impossible that he survived. This is a Jedi Master with ridiculous reflexes. We've seen people survive worse in Star Wars. Maul got sliced in half and fell into a bottomless pit, came back angrier than ever. Palpatine literally exploded and came back in the sequel trilogy through weird cloning tech. Even Anakin got burned alive, lost all his limbs, and somehow came back as Darth Vader. Survival in Star Wars has a wide margin. Mace Windu had the Force, years of combat experience, and knew how to fall. Jedi get thrown from ridiculous heights all the time and walk it off. Plus, Coruscant's lower levels are cluttered with landing platforms, speeders, infrastructure. There's a chance he landed on something or used the Force to slow his fall. Maybe he was injured, maybe unconscious for a while, but gone? Not necessarily. And here's the thing, there was nobody. Nobody went to retrieve it, nobody talks about it afterward. You'd think the Jedi would have looked for him, or that Palpatine would have wanted to confirm the kill. Instead, nothing. In a galaxy where people get holograms of every fight and report everything to the Senate, the aftermath of Windu's fall is just silent. That silence is what makes this theory grow. So let's say Mace survived. What then? He's lost a hand, probably scarred from the lightning, and his entire belief system just got shattered. He learned that the Chancellor was the Sith Lord they'd been hunting for years, and the guy he barely trusted, Anakin Skywalker, betrayed him and helped turn the Republic into an empire. The Jedi Temple is about to be purged. His friends are either dead or in hiding. And if he shows his face, he's dead too. That kind of trauma would push anyone into hiding, especially someone like Windu. He wasn't the type to run from a fight, but this wasn't a fight anymore. It was war, and they lost. So maybe he escaped underground. Maybe he went off-world, vanished into the deeper parts of the galaxy where nobody would recognize him. Think of it like a self-imposed exile. He's not running, he's regrouping, waiting for a moment that never really came. And here's where things get interesting. Mace Windu had always walked a thin line in the Force. He used Varpad, a lightsaber form that channeled aggression and darkness. But instead of falling, he mastered it. He never became a Sith, but he understood the edge. If someone like that were forced into hiding, wounded, betrayed, and watching the galaxy collapse around him, what would he become over time? It's easy to imagine Windu turning into something the Jedi never would have allowed before. A grey figure operating outside the code. Not evil, not twisted, but colder, harder, more distant. He might still believe in justice, but not in the way the Jedi taught. Maybe he starts seeing the Jedi Order as too rigid, too blind, maybe even partly responsible for their own downfall. That shift wouldn't be instant, but over years in isolation, with all that guilt and anger building up, it's not hard to see. Some fans believe he became a Force hermit, like Yoda or Obi-Wan, but not as peaceful. More like a ghost, watching from afar, still connected to the Force, but detached from everything else. There's even the wild theory that he later re-emerged in another form, either as a secret mentor or something darker, something stranger. Which brings us to the Snoke theory, the one we'll really dig into in the next part. Because once you start connecting Windu's survival with the rise of the First Order, the timeline starts to get kind of weird in a way that almost makes sense, even if it's never confirmed. And even if Snoke wasn't Windu, the idea of a scarred, exiled Force user out there, still walking around the galaxy long after the war ended, that idea doesn't sound so far-fetched anymore. So if we really entertain the idea that Mace Windu survived his fall, then we've got to ask, where did he go? A Jedi Master doesn't just crash through a window, vanish into the city, and then grab a calf in the lower levels like nothing happened. But Windu wasn't your average Jedi. He wasn't naive, and he definitely wasn't someone to go down without a plan. If he did survive, he would have known immediately that he couldn't go back. The Jedi Order was finished, the Senate was compromised, and his own face had likely just been plastered across every Imperial wanted list in the galaxy. He would have had to disappear, ditch the robes, the lightsaber, the identity, everything. Go somewhere the Empire wouldn't look. Some people imagine him hiding on a remote outer rim planet, blending in as a wanderer, maybe injured, maybe bitter, but alive. Others think he could have gone deeper into the galaxy's underworld, changing his appearance, keeping his connection to the Force buried, but always watching. Either way, he's not the kind of guy to just sit around and do nothing. Even in exile, he'd be searching for something. Maybe redemption, maybe revenge, maybe just a way to keep the light alive, even if no one sees it. There's also the psychological side to think about. Windu was a strict Jedi, a master of control, and he walked right up to the line between light and dark every time he fought. That was the whole point of Varpad, using aggression and channeling the enemy's darkness through himself without falling. But after what happened in Palpatine's office, everything he believed in would have been shattered. He wasn't just betrayed by the Sith, he was betrayed by the very system he swore to protect. The Jedi didn't listen, the Republic was already lost, and Anakin, someone he didn't trust from the beginning, was the final blow. If that didn't push him into isolation, nothing would. Now, let's go a bit deeper into the Snoke theory. Yeah, at first glance it sounds like a meme. Mace Windu is Snoke? Really? But there are people who've pieced together small details that make you tilt your head a bit. Snoke's disfigurement, for example, it's severe, and we never get a clear explanation for it. He's scarred, hunched, like someone who went through something violent. Windu was blasted with Force lightning, lost a hand, and potentially fell from hundreds of meters. If he survived, he wouldn't be in great shape. He might have needed the same sort of medical rebuilding we saw with Vader. But more than that, Snoke isn't quite Sith. He uses the dark side, but he talks about balance. He manipulates more than he dominates, and he doesn't follow the usual Sith traditions. That's interesting when you remember that Windu himself was always walking that fine line, using darkness as a tool without giving into it. If someone like that snapped, if he lost faith in the Jedi, the Republic, and maybe even the Force itself, you could imagine a version of him re-emerging decades later, scarred, twisted, and convinced that the only way to fix the galaxy is by controlling it from the top. Again, nothing in the official canon backs this up. It's all speculation, but that's what makes it fun. The timeline even kind of works, depending on how you twist it. Mace Windu would be old by the time Snoke appears. But this is Star Wars. Old doesn't mean weak, and the Force tends to keep people alive longer than normal. Even if Snoke isn't Windu, the core of the theory still stands. Mace could have lived, just not as the same person. And there's something poetic about that idea, even without the drama. A Jedi who gave everything, lost everything, and still found a way to stay alive. Not as a hero, not as a legend, but as a quiet presence in the galaxy. Maybe saving a few lives here and there, maybe guiding someone who reminded him of what was lost. The kind of character who shows up in the margins of other people's stories. Never fully explained, but always leaving an impression. We see this kind of role show up in Star Wars all the time. Obi-Wan went into exile and quietly protected Luke. Ahsoka walked away from the Jedi and became something entirely different. Yoda vanished to Dagobah to wait. There's no reason Windu couldn't have done something similar, just with a bit more pain and bitterness in the mix. The real mystery is why he's never mentioned again. No grave, no tribute, no lingering question from any of the characters we follow. Even when Yoda and Obi-Wan regroup, there's no "what about Mace?" That silence is either a massive oversight or an intentional hint that his story wasn't over yet. And Star Wars loves a good comeback. The fanbase would lose their minds if a live-action series suddenly featured an old, grizzled, Force-wounded Mace Windu popping up in a distant corner of the galaxy, alive, quiet, but still watching. So maybe that's where he is now. Maybe he didn't become Snoke or a villain, or a Shadow Emperor. Maybe he just stayed hidden because the galaxy moved on without him, and he knew the moment he stepped back into the light, he'd either become a target or a symbol. And maybe after everything he saw, the corruption, the war, the fall of Anakin, he didn't want to be either. In the end, that's what keeps this theory alive. It's not just about survival, it's about possibility. Star Wars has always been full of missing pieces, and Windu's story is one of the biggest. We never saw the body. We never saw the last breath. And until we do, the idea of him still being out there somewhere, scarred, hidden, maybe still holding a purple lightsaber in the shadows, feels like something that might not just be fan fiction, but a story still waiting to be told. So let's talk about something that's been sitting quietly in the background of Star Wars for a long time. Something that starts to sound more reasonable the more you think about it. What if the Jedi weren't completely right about the Force? What if their interpretation, the version they lived by for generations, wasn't the full picture? Or worse, what if it was off balance from the start? We're always told the dark side is evil, dangerous, destructive, a path that leads straight to suffering and chaos. It's the foundation of how the Jedi trained their younglings, how they built their code, how they approached every decision. But the more we see across the movies, especially in the prequels and beyond, the more that strict view starts to crack a little. It's easy to say the dark side is bad when you only see it in the hands of people like Palpatine and Vader. But are those really the best examples of what the dark side actually is? Let's start with how the Jedi treat emotions. Fear, anger, attachment, all of it is seen as dangerous. They teach their younglings to suppress feelings, to detach from love, to avoid personal connections. The idea is that emotions lead to chaos, and chaos leads to the dark side. But is that really how emotions work? In real life, we don't become villains because we care about people. We don't fall into darkness because we feel grief. In fact, the lack of emotion, the inability to connect, is what makes people cold and disconnected. Maybe it's not the emotions themselves that are dangerous. Maybe it's how the Jedi were trained to fear them. Anakin's story is the clearest example. He was told to suppress his love for Padme, to hide his fear about losing her, to push down every human instinct he had. But those feelings didn't go away. They just built up inside him until he exploded. He wasn't corrupted by the dark side overnight. He was cornered into it. The Jedi gave him no space to process the very things that made him human. And when Palpatine offered him a path that actually acknowledged his fear, even if it was twisted, it felt more honest than anything the Jedi had offered. Now imagine a Jedi Order that didn't fear emotions. Imagine if they taught their students to understand their feelings, to sit with them, to channel them through the Force, instead of pretending they didn't exist. That version of the Jedi might have prevented the rise of the Empire entirely. They might have created a more balanced approach to the Force, one that wasn't all about denial and restriction. Because here's the thing, the Force is clearly bigger than any single philosophy. We see Force users all across the galaxy, and not all of them fit into the Jedi mold. Some are more neutral, some use both sides, some connect to the Force in ways the Jedi would have never approved of. The Night Sisters, for example, use a form of the Force that's strange, mystical, and tied to life and death in ways that don't fit neatly into light or dark. Are they evil? Not necessarily. Dangerous? Sure, but so were the Jedi, depending on how you look at it. Even characters like Qui-Gon Jinn, who was part of the Jedi Order, started drifting from the traditional teachings. He believed in trusting the living Force, acting on instinct, following what felt right even if it broke the rules. And the Council didn't love that. They saw him as rebellious, difficult, unpredictable. But Qui-Gon wasn't evil. He was just open to the idea that maybe the Jedi didn't have all the answers. There's also the way the Jedi handled prophecy and control. They thought they could predict the future, that the Chosen One would bring balance by destroying the Sith, and that their role in that prophecy was central. But they misunderstood it, and in trying to control it, they helped create the conditions that made Anakin fall. That's not balance, that's arrogance. And it points to a deeper problem. The Jedi weren't trying to understand the Force. They were trying to manage it, control it, mold it into something safe and clean. The dark side, in contrast, is raw. It's full of emotion, instinct, power, risk. It's messy. But is that always a bad thing? When you look at Force users like the Bendu in Star Wars Rebels, or even characters like Ahsoka, who leave the Jedi Order but continue to follow their own moral compass, you start to see this grey space where the Force isn't light or dark, it's just the Force. It responds to intention, to clarity, to emotion. Maybe it's not about rejecting one side, but understanding both and learning how to stay grounded. And that's the core of this theory, that the Jedi may have been missing half the truth, that their fear of the dark side blinded them to a more balanced, more nuanced understanding of the Force. They were too focused on purity, and in doing so, they lost touch with what the Force might really be, a living energy that's meant to flow freely, through all aspects of life, even the uncomfortable ones. This idea doesn't make the Sith right, and it doesn't excuse everything that happened. But it does raise a big question. If the Jedi had been more flexible, more emotionally aware, more willing to embrace the complexity of the Force instead of boxing it into categories, would the galaxy have been spared all that pain? We'll dig into that in the next part, because there's more to this than just philosophy. When you look at what comes after the Jedi Order, how new Force users approach the Force, and how the sequels start bending the old rules, you start to see a shift. And maybe that shift was long overdue. So let's pick things up with what came after the fall of the Jedi Order, because that's where this idea really starts to evolve. When the old rules were swept away, what filled the gap wasn't a new version of the Jedi. It was people trying to understand the Force on their own terms. Luke Skywalker, for example, didn't grow up inside the temple, didn't get trained in that strict, emotionless way. He came at the Force from a different angle, and maybe that's why he made different choices. Luke's journey was built on connection. He didn't defeat Vader through violence or control. He saved him through compassion. He felt his father's presence, saw the good that was buried deep down, and reached out with empathy instead of aggression. That alone flipped the Jedi philosophy on its head. He didn't follow the Council's approach. He trusted his feelings, leaned into them, and used that emotional clarity to bring someone back from the edge. And yet, even Luke struggled with the old Jedi mindset. When he tried to rebuild the Order, he slipped back into the same patterns. Strict teaching, fear of the dark side, pressure to control outcomes. It didn't work. His failure with Ben Solo showed that repeating the past wasn't the answer. You can't take a rigid, ancient structure that already collapsed and expect it to suddenly succeed just because it has a new name. That realization broke him for a while. When we meet Luke again in The Last Jedi, he's isolated, bitter, convinced that the Jedi need to end. A lot of people didn't love that version of Luke, but if you look at it through this lens, it makes more sense. He saw the cracks in the Jedi's foundation, not just in their methods, but in their whole view of the Force. And once he stepped away from it all, he started to see a deeper truth. The Force doesn't belong to anyone, and no single group gets to define it forever. I know a lot of you don't like the sequel trilogy, but let's talk about this. Then comes Rey, someone with no deep Jedi training, no long Jedi lineage, and no clear blueprint for how to use the Force. She comes into it with raw instinct, emotion, confusion, all the things the old Jedi would have told her to repress. And what's interesting is how strong her connection becomes, because she listens to those instincts. She doesn't fully lean toward the light or the dark, and that's the point. She's constantly trying to understand both without falling into either one's trap. And then there's Kylo Ren, who might be one of the clearest examples of what happens when someone is pulled between the two sides with no guidance that actually makes sense. He wasn't corrupted in some clean, binary way. He was raised with expectation, trained with pressure, exposed to fear, and caught between two extremes that both demanded full loyalty. But he's never really at peace in either space. He lashes out, but not because he's purely evil. He's angry, confused, abandoned, and constantly chasing a sense of identity. What we get through characters like Rey and Kylo isn't just more lightsaber duels or Force showdowns. We see the Force being approached with more complexity. People are no longer picking a side because they were told to. They're learning through struggle, through personal experience. The old Jedi model doesn't work anymore, and the galaxy seems to be moving on, slowly and painfully, towards something more flexible. Even the idea of balance starts to shift. Instead of wiping out the Sith or re-establishing the Jedi Council, the idea of balance becomes more internal, more emotional. It's not about defeating the dark side. It's about understanding why it's appealing in the first place, why it speaks to pain, to fear, to survival. You can't get rid of that, but you can make pelmic peace with it. That doesn't mean embracing evil or letting go of morality. It just means admitting that the Force isn't clean-cut. It has shadows, it has light, and maybe both are necessary. The Jedi tried to cut out half the experience of being alive: fear, love, anger, attachment. But people are messy, and trying to be perfect doesn't make you stronger. It just makes you more likely to fall apart when real emotions hit. You see this quiet shift happening even outside the main characters. Ahsoka Tano, who walked away from the Jedi Order, continues using the Force, but refuses to claim the Jedi title again. She's found her own balance, separate from the old ways, And that kind of independence might be what the future of the Force actually looks like. Same with characters like Bendu, who live in the grey, not good or evil, but aware that both exist and need to be acknowledged. What this theory really argues is that the Jedi's mistake wasn't their intentions, it was their refusal to evolve. They saw themselves as guardians of peace, but they ignored the emotional reality of the beings they were trying to train and lead. They believed in the light side so much that they closed their eyes to the full nature of the Force, and that blind spot is what let the Sith rise again and again. Now that the old structure has collapsed, the galaxy has a chance to build something new. Force users don't need to pick a side and stick to it. They can find their own center, their own clarity, without being boxed into ancient definitions. That shift might be slow, it might be messy, but it's probably more honest than anything that came before. And maybe that's what true balance really is. Not silence, not purity, but the ability to stand in the middle of chaos and still act with purpose. To feel everything, the fear, the anger, the hope, and not be ruled by any of it. That version of the Force doesn't need temples or codes. It just needs people willing to face themselves fully and live with the consequences. So here's the thing. When the rise of Skywalker brought Palpatine back, a lot of people weren't exactly thrilled. Some felt like it came out of nowhere. Others said it made everything from the original trilogy feel less meaningful. And yeah, on the surface it really does seem like he just pops back up out of the blue, strapped to some creepy mechanical arm, muttering about clones and dark science. But what if there was actually a reason he waited so long to return? What if Palpatine was hiding all that time, not because he was weak or rebuilding, but because he was scared of Luke Skywalker? That's where this theory kicks in. It suggests that Palpatine didn't make a move until he was sure Luke was dead, or at least out of the way for good, which actually makes a lot of sense when you look at how Palpatine has always operated. The guy doesn't make moves until he knows the odds are in his favor. He didn't overthrow the Republic overnight. He spent decades working behind the scenes, creating wars, playing both sides, watching the Jedi from the shadows before he ever showed his hand. He waited for the right time, the perfect storm. And when he finally did rise up, it was because he knew no one could stop him. Now fast forward to after Return of the Jedi. The Empire has collapsed, he's supposedly dead, and Luke is now this legend, who not only helped bring balance to the Force, but redeemed Darth Vader in the process. That's a big deal. From Palpatine's perspective, Luke isn't just another Jedi, he's the threat. He did something no one else could do. He cracked Vader's armor in a way even Palpatine couldn't. That alone would be enough to give him pause. If Luke could reach Anakin's heart, he could absolutely ruin whatever backup plan Palpatine had brewing in the unknown regions. So the idea is that Palpatine retreats, watches the galaxy rebuild from afar, and basically sits on the bench while Luke is active. Not because he's lost, but because the one person capable of stopping him is still alive. If Luke's around, there's always a risk, and Palpatine doesn't like risk. He waits, watches, lets time pass. Maybe he's rebuilding his strength. Maybe he's experimenting with cloning tech, working with Sith cultists, gathering resources. But he never steps back into the spotlight, never announces himself, not even a whisper, because Luke's presence alone is enough to keep him in check. This would explain the weird silence from Palpatine during the events of the sequels. The First Order rises, Snoke commands fleets, and Palpatine is nowhere to be seen. But if you see Snoke as a puppet, which the movies basically confirmed, then that makes sense too. Palpatine is still there, still watching, just not showing his face yet. And why? Because Luke is still walking around, training Jedi, building something. That's not the right time for a comeback, and it fits Palpatine's style. He never confronts power directly unless he knows he can win. He didn't attack the Jedi until he had the clones. He didn't fight the Republic until he controlled it. He's the definition of patient. So if he's got a secret cloning facility out in the unknown regions, and he's trying to build a new vessel for his consciousness, he's not going to risk blowing that plan by popping up too soon. Then comes Luke's exile. After everything goes wrong with Ben Solo, Luke vanishes. People think he's gone, the galaxy starts to move on, and the Jedi fade into myth again. And that's when Palpatine starts pushing more aggressively. Snoke becomes more active. The First Order becomes more powerful. It's like he's testing the waters, waiting to see if Luke will reappear. And when he doesn't, when Luke stays in hiding, Palpatine sees the opportunity opening. He lets the First Order take control, lets Kylo rise, all while waiting in the background for the right moment. What really drives this theory home is how sudden Palpatine's return is once Luke actually dies. In The Last Jedi, Luke sacrifices himself, becomes one with the Force, and almost immediately after that, Palpatine reveals himself in The Rise of Skywalker. The timing is too tight to be a coincidence. He doesn't slowly return, he just shows up out of nowhere, fully armed, fully prepared, fleet ready, plan in motion. And the Resistance is caught completely off guard. It's like he was waiting behind a locked door, hand on the knob, just waiting to hear the click. Once Luke was gone, that click happened. The last real Jedi threat was out of the picture, and that was the final green light Palpatine needed. Let's be real for a second, because this part of Revenge of the Sith always felt off. Padme Amidala, former queen, fierce senator, survivor of political assassinations, war, betrayal, just gives up and dies, like that. The medical droid literally says she's healthy, physically fine, but she's dying anyway because she lost the will to live. That's what we're told. That's the most confusing moment in the movie. There's no clear reason. She had kids to raise, people counting on her, a new life ahead, and she still fades away. It feels like something's missing, like there's a piece of that moment we're not being told. So here's the theory, and it's not even that far-fetched if you think about it in the context of the Force and what we know about Palpatine. Padme didn't die because she lost hope. She died because her life was taken from her. Not metaphorically, literally drained. Pulled from her and used for something else. And the one person with both the power and the motive to do that was Palpatine. Because in that exact window of time, Anakin Skywalker was on the edge of death, and Palpatine needed him. We're shown how bad Anakin's injuries are. His lungs are gone, his body's burned, he's unconscious in lava. There's nothing left of him except pain and fragments of what he used to be. And yet Palpatine arrives just in time, hauls him out of the fire, and somehow he survives. Not as a patient, as Vader. He gets a full body reconstruction, goes through a complete transformation, and by the time it's over, he's standing, breathing through machines, filled with anger. And that transformation doesn't feel like regular surgery. It feels like something more. Now, when that's happening, look at what's going on with Padme. She's in a medical facility, and then she starts to fade. Slowly, quietly. Nobody understands why. The medical droids, literal machines designed to read the human body, have no explanation. There's no pressure loss, no cardiac failure, no injuries. They just say she's dying, and the moment they say it, the film cuts back and forth between her and Anakin, being remade into Vader. One life goes down, another is pulled back up. And Palpatine is at the center of that moment. He had already told Anakin earlier in the movie that there were Sith powers capable of manipulating life and death. He brings up Darth Plagueis, talks about the ability to keep loved ones from dying. It's framed as a temptation, sure, but why would Palpatine bring it up if he didn't know something real about it? He doesn't just make things up to sound spooky. He knew those powers existed, maybe even used them before, and he wouldn't have dangled them in front of Anakin if there wasn't a plan in motion. So when Anakin gets cut down and Palpatine finds him, what if he knew exactly what to do? What if he needed a source of life to bring Vader back? Not a spell, not a ritual, just a raw force transfer. Pull energy from one being and give it to another. We've seen it happen in newer Star Wars material. Rey heals creatures, brings Kylo back from death. Grogu heals Grief Karga. The Force can be used to restore life, but it's not free. It costs something. With the Sith, that cost could be someone else's life, and Padme was right there. Vulnerable, isolated, connected to Anakin through the Force. It wasn't a coincidence that she died when she did. It was part of the same moment. Anakin rising required something in return, and Palpatine didn't hesitate. He needed his apprentice alive. Not for sentimental reasons, but because Vader was his tool, his weapon, his future. Padme was an obstacle, a weakness that could pull Anakin back to the light. If he survived and she did too, there'd always be a chance Anakin might find his way back. So Palpatine made sure that wouldn't happen. He shows up at Mustafar as soon as Anakin falls. He doesn't even check Padme's location. He doesn't care. He already knows she's dying, because he's making it happen. And once he revives Anakin and puts the armor on him, he breaks the news. He tells Vader she's dead. No remorse, no hesitation. Just another piece of the plan. He tells him it was his own fault, that his anger killed her, and Vader screams. He loses it. That's the final push Palpatine needed. Now he has someone broken, angry, with no one left to pull him back. It's brutal, but it's calculated. Palpatine didn't let Padme die. He took her life and used it as fuel. And by doing that, he killed two people in one moment, Padme, and whatever was left of Anakin Skywalker. And the most twisted part, Anakin never finds out the truth. He lives with the weight of believing he caused it. All those years, all that guilt, all because Palpatine told him what he needed him to believe. Meanwhile, the real reason Padme died stayed buried. No one ever suspected it. Not Obi-Wan, not Bail Organa, not even Yoda. They all just accepted the droid's report, but they weren't trained to see the Force at work like that. They didn't feel the drain. They didn't see the timing for what it really was. One of the darkest moves in the entire story. Now that we've laid out how Padme's death might actually have been caused by Palpatine's dark intervention, it's worth thinking about what that means for the bigger picture, for Anakin's transformation, and for Palpatine's ultimate plan. Because this wasn't just about saving a single body, it was about breaking a spirit and building a weapon. Anakin was more than just a Jedi or a skilled pilot. He was the chosen one, or at least that's what everyone believed. His power was supposed to bring balance to the Force, but what really happened was that he got pulled into a dark trap. Palpatine had to make sure Anakin survived, but he also had to make sure that Anakin never went back to the light. Using Padme's life to keep Anakin alive was cruel, but it was brilliant for Palpatine. Think about how that guilt weighed on Anakin in the years that followed. He believed he had caused Padme's death, that his own anger and fall had destroyed her. That kind of burden would eat at anyone. But it also made him vulnerable, dependent on Palpatine's manipulations, stuck in a cycle of self-loathing and rage. He couldn't let go because of the pain he carried, and Palpatine knew exactly how to exploit that. The trauma and the physical injuries alone wouldn't have been enough to turn Anakin fully into Darth Vader. It was this combination, the physical rebuilding and the emotional shattering, that made the man into the monster, and it all started with the life taken from Padme. Palpatine had to make a choice, and he chose power over compassion. He chose to sacrifice a woman he didn't care about to keep a weapon alive. What's also interesting is how this theory shifts how we view Anakin's legacy. Instead of him being responsible for Padme's death, he becomes more of a victim than the films make him out to be. A victim of Palpatine's cruelty and plans. It adds a layer of tragedy to his story. Not just that he fell, but that his fall was engineered so completely. Padme was collateral damage in a much bigger game. Then there's the matter of how this idea fits into the wider Star Wars universe. We know the Force is deeper and stranger than it appears. Newer stories have explored the idea that life energy can be manipulated, transferred, and even stolen. What happened on Mustafar could be one of the earliest examples of that, a dark ritual masked as tragedy. It also makes you wonder how far Palpatine was willing to go. If he could take Padme's life like that, what else did he do behind the scenes? How many people suffered quietly while he built his empire? The Sith are about power and control, but also about sacrifice, usually the sacrifice of others. This theory puts that front and center, showing how Palpatine didn't just conquer governments or Jedi, but actually toyed with life itself. And when you think about Anakin's future, it adds weight to everything he does as Vader. Every time he chokes someone, every time he lashes out, there's a layer beneath it all. Pain, regret, loss. A pain that started with a life taken so he could survive. It's almost like Vader is haunted by Padme in a way we don't fully see on screen. Not as a ghost, but as the invisible cost of his survival. That also gives a different perspective on Luke and Leia's birth. They came into the world at such a dark time. Their mother fading away, their father broken and rebuilt as a Sith, and yet they represented hope, the spark that eventually challenged the darkness. Knowing the sacrifice behind their existence makes their stories feel even more fragile and precious. So when you watch Return of the Jedi and Vader chooses to save Luke, you realize it wasn't just a heroic moment, it was a redemption built on the ashes of everything that Palpatine took. Maybe part of Vader's last act was an attempt to make up for what he lost, to give his children a chance that he never had. The theory doesn't just fill a plot hole or explain a weird scene, It changes the emotional center of the whole story. Padme's death stops feeling like a convenient plot device and becomes a dark moment of real sacrifice. Anakin's fall becomes a calculated tragedy, not just a personal failure, and Palpatine's manipulation reaches a new level of terrifying. What's cool about this theory is it doesn't rely on magic or mystery that feels out of place. It fits perfectly with the tone of the prequels and the original trilogy when you think about the characters and their motivations. It's about choices, consequences, and the costs of power. It's about what happens when someone treats life like a game they control. And it reminds us that Star Wars, beneath all its battles and spaceships, is still a story. About people. About love, loss, and how far someone will go to protect what they care about, even if it means destroying something else in the process. There's a reason the prophecy of the Chosen One ended up being so misunderstood. The Jedi treated it like it was a riddle to solve, but they never had a real plan for what would happen if someone actually fulfilled it. They assumed whoever this Chosen One was, they'd be born into the Jedi Order, trained, and eventually stop the Sith. That was the entire vision. Stop the Sith and balance would be restored, clean and easy, but they never stopped to think about what that actually meant. What if balance wasn't about victory? What if it meant something a lot more uncomfortable, like the removal of both orders entirely? That's where Anakin's story starts to make a lot more sense. Not as someone who failed the prophecy, but as someone who completed it in a way nobody expected or wanted. Anakin was never like the others. Even before his training, his connection to the Force was so strong that it made the Council nervous. He was older, less disciplined, and came from a background far outside the temple walls. And when Qui-Gon found him, he saw something the others didn't. Raw instinct, purpose, potential. But Qui-Gon wasn't around long enough to finish what he started, and Anakin was thrown into a system that didn't know what to do with someone like him. The Jedi tried to mold him into their version of a Jedi Knight, but Anakin never fully fit. He wasn't just too emotional, he was too aware of the world around him. He didn't just follow orders, he questioned them. When he saw suffering, he didn't respond with meditation, he wanted to act. That constant friction between him and the Jedi way kept building over time. It wasn't rebellion for its own sake, it was a reaction to rules that didn't match reality. And the reality was that the galaxy was falling apart. The Clone Wars pushed the Jedi from peacekeepers into generals, and Anakin was thrown right into the center of it. He fought battles, led troops, made impossible choices, and he started seeing how fragile the Jedi really were. They gave speeches about peace, but they were fighting a brutal war. They claimed to be free of attachments, but they clearly had favorites and politics inside the temple. The more Anakin saw behind the curtain, the less faith he had in what they were teaching him. Palpatine took advantage of that slow erosion. He never rushed it. He played the long game, always present, always reassuring, always showing Anakin that there was another way. Palpatine didn't convert Anakin in a single moment. He gradually earned his trust by doing the one thing the Jedi never did, listening. When Anakin had doubts, Palpatine leaned in. When he felt anger, Palpatine told him it was natural. When he feared losing Padme, Palpatine said he could help. By the time Anakin turned, it wasn't some sharp, dramatic break. It was a slow collapse of everything he had believed in. When Order 66 was triggered and the Jedi were wiped out, Anakin wasn't just following orders, he was acting out a belief that had been shaped over years, that the Jedi had become blind, ineffective, and dangerous. Walking into the Jedi Temple and doing what he did wasn't a moment of madness. It was a calculated step forward in a plan he thought would save the galaxy. What makes it harder to look away from is that he wasn't entirely wrong. The Jedi had lost their grip on reality. They let their rules become more important than compassion, and they misunderstood the prophecy from the beginning. They thought the Chosen One would protect their way of life. Instead, Anakin burned it to the ground. The destruction of the Jedi wasn't the end of his path, though. It was just the first half. What Anakin didn't realize, not then, not yet, was that he hadn't actually brought balance. He had only removed one piece. The Sith still ruled through Palpatine, and Anakin himself had taken on the role of enforcer. It wasn't a victory, it was a shift in position. He traded one uniform for another and continued to serve under someone else's control. But that's what makes the prophecy even more complicated. If Anakin was meant to destroy the imbalance, and the Jedi had been part of that imbalance, then maybe their downfall wasn't a failure. Maybe it was necessary. And maybe Palpatine, in all his power, had become the other half of the equation. Anakin didn't know it yet, but he wasn't done. His story wasn't finished. He had already broken one system. The other was still standing, and he was about to spend the next 2 decades locked inside it. Anakin didn't escape the prison he'd been pulled into. For years he stayed locked behind the mask, following commands, crushing enemies, chasing down scraps of resistance across the galaxy. Whatever freedom he thought he'd gain when he turned was replaced by duty to someone else's vision. There wasn't room for anything else. Until Luke showed up. When Luke appeared, everything started shifting. He wasn't shaped by the temple, didn't follow a rigid code, and didn't carry the weight of old wars. He grew up far away from politics and philosophy, but he still cared deeply, still chased answers, still reached out when others might have pulled away. And when he came face to face with Vader, he didn't treat him like an enemy to kill. He treated him like a person worth reaching. That's what began to pull something loose inside. For over 20 years, Vader had only known structure and silence. Kill who needed to be killed, obey, repeat. But Luke brought in something unexpected, a conversation. Anakin hadn't been called on to think in a long time, and now here was someone pushing him to feel again. That had weight. When Palpatine tried to turn Luke, he used the same approach that had worked on Anakin. Push the fear, push the anger, dig up the desperation, but Luke pushed back by refusing to go along with it. Luke stood there, tired and beaten, but still clear-headed, refusing to strike down his own father. That silence did more than any lightsaber swing. It forced Anakin to finally look at the cost of all of it. And what he saw was the exact thing he had been trying to avoid since the beginning. The possibility of losing someone he loved, again, right in front of him. Padme was gone. The Jedi were gone. His old self was buried deep under metal and commands. But now Luke, his own son, was about to be destroyed. And he was the only one in the room who could stop it. So he did. He turned because it was the only option left that made sense. He lifted Palpatine and ended the chain right there. The Sith, in that moment, fell with him. There was no rival waiting in the wings, no new apprentice ready to take the throne. Palpatine had built his empire on one rule: control everything. And now the person he thought he controlled the most was the one who brought him down. That's what finished what started all those years ago. Anakin had already ended the Jedi Order during the Clone Wars. He had helped execute the Purge, marched into the temple, dismantled the only system he'd ever been part of, and now he had destroyed the Sith from within. That doesn't erase what came before. Anakin made choices that led to loss, destruction, and fear across the galaxy. But his last decision didn't come from orders or ideology. It came from something older, more human. The need to protect someone, even at the end. Luke lived, the Empire collapsed, and the galaxy was left with nothing standing on either side. The Jedi were gone. The Sith were gone. That's where the real balance finally showed up. Not in who won, but in what was left behind. It also recontextualizes the role of Luke. He wasn't there to replace the Jedi as they were. He wasn't trained the same way, didn't follow the same rules, and didn't carry their history. What he tried to build afterward was never meant to be a carbon copy of the past. He wanted to do better, but that meant starting from scratch. He had to learn things the hard way, and we saw later on that even with good intentions, rebuilding something without repeating the same mistakes was nearly impossible. Still, Luke's story only happened because of the space Anakin made. The galaxy had been locked in a fight between two extremes, and Anakin broke both of them. That might have been the real meaning behind the prophecy, not about saving one side or crushing the other, but ending the loop altogether. The Jedi had grown rigid and disconnected. The Sith were obsessive and selfish. Both systems fell apart because neither was built to adapt, and Anakin, pulled from both sides, ended up being the one to close the door on both of them. It wasn't clean, it didn't follow a neat path, but that's exactly why it mattered, because what came next, whatever anyone tried to build afterward, had to be different, had to be shaped by new voices, new values, not just inherited rules. So when people say Anakin failed the prophecy, they might be missing the point. He didn't fail it, he finished it, just in a way no one saw coming. The Jedi and Sith thought they had the answers. Anakin erased both, and through that erasure, the future actually had a chance to breathe again. Imagine for a moment you are right there in the Jedi Temple, walking alongside Yoda. You've always seen him as the wise, calm master who guides the Jedi with his deep knowledge and calm presence. But what if he sensed something terrible was coming? Something that would shatter the galaxy? And yet he let it happen. It sounds strange, right? Why would Yoda, one of the greatest Jedi Masters, someone who has lived for centuries, someone who knows the Force better than almost anyone, just stand by while Order 66 unfolded like a dark storm? Well, the truth is more complicated, and that's where the story really gets interesting. Yoda felt the darkness growing. He could sense the shift in the Force, the subtle tremors that whispered of an immense danger. It wasn't a sudden shock, but a slow, creeping shadow that had been building for years. He didn't need a crystal ball to see it coming. The signs were all around him, in the corruption, in the tension, in the unease spreading across the Republic. He felt the echoes of betrayal in the minds of the clone troopers, the very soldiers sworn to protect the Jedi. But here's the catch. Yoda wasn't blind and he wasn't paralyzed by fear. He had to let it happen, for reasons that were deeply connected to the balance of the Force itself. Imagine carrying a burden so heavy that trying to change what's destined might cause even greater harm. You might wonder, did Yoda want this destruction? Of course not. He grieved over it, felt the loss of his comrades like a wound in his own soul. But sometimes, knowing the future means accepting that some pain is necessary, that the galaxy needs to go through this dark night before the dawn. Picture this, Yoda quietly observing the rise of Palpatine, knowing the Chancellor's true identity as Darth Sidious, but forced to tread carefully. Every move had to be precise, every action measured. If the Jedi openly challenged Palpatine before the time was right, the Republic could have descended into chaos even faster. The Republic was fragile, and the Jedi Order was seen by many as disconnected from the people they swore to protect. This all leads to a painful question. Was Yoda powerless or choosing patience? He was neither, really. He was playing a long game, one most of us can barely understand. The Force has its own mysterious ways of keeping balance. When the darkness grew too strong, it was Yoda's role to endure, to survive, and to help rebuild afterward. What would you have done if you knew a storm was coming, one that could destroy everything you loved? But if you acted too soon, it would only make things worse. Yoda's knowledge didn't make him invincible. The clone troopers were his own soldiers, trained to kill the Jedi without hesitation when the order came. Imagine that shock, that betrayal. Even a master like Yoda couldn't stop the execution of the plan immediately. The galaxy shifted in an instant, trust shattered, and the Jedi found themselves hunted and betrayed by those they once trusted. But why did Yoda survive? Why was he spared in this massive purge? Part of it was chance, part of it was skill, but it was also because the Force had a plan. Yoda was meant to carry the light forward, even as everything around him fell apart. His survival wasn't just luck, it was destiny. Still, the question remains, if Yoda knew Order 66 was coming, why didn't he prepare the Jedi better? You might think the wisest Jedi would have been ready with a backup plan, or at least an early warning system that would keep the Jedi safe. But the truth is, the Jedi were caught in their own blindness. They had grown complacent, bound by their strict codes and beliefs, unable to see that the real danger wasn't a sudden attack, but the slow erosion of everything they stood for. The Jedi Council had made mistakes, underestimated the Sith's cunning, and trusted too much in the Republic and the clones. Yoda's foresight was clear, but it wasn't absolute. Sometimes, the Force shows glimpses of the future, not the whole picture. He sensed danger, but couldn't prevent every outcome. It's like standing at a crossroads in a dark forest, knowing the path ahead is treacherous. But you can't see exactly what lies beyond the trees. You can only prepare as best you can and hope to survive. And survive Yoda did, retreating to the swamps of Dagobah, where he waited and healed, keeping hope alive for the future. He became a quiet guardian, watching the galaxy from the shadows. You can picture Yoda in the swamps of Dagobah, right? He's out there, alone in the thick mud and vines, far away from everything he once knew. The Jedi Order that stood for thousands of years is now barely a whisper. The galaxy feels darker than ever. He's sitting there, thinking, trying to figure out what to do next. Losing so many Jedi, watching friends get hunted down by their own soldiers. That's something that would shake anyone to their core. And Yoda's no exception. Even with all his wisdom and power, he's human in the sense that he feels every loss deeply. But what's remarkable is that he doesn't let it stop him. Instead, he takes a step back. The galaxy isn't ready for a fight right now, and Yoda gets that better than anyone. He's not one to make reckless moves. If you think about it, patience is kind of a superpower here. That's when Luke Skywalker enters the picture. Yoda sees something in this kid, a kind of hope. He's inexperienced and unpolished, sure, but that's part of why he's important. Yoda knows that the old ways of the Jedi didn't work out so well, so maybe a fresh start is what the galaxy needs. Yoda pushes Luke to think about what it means to have power, how easy it is to let it slip into the wrong hands, or to lose yourself trying to control it. It's not a comfortable lesson. Yoda's style is more like tough love, often making Luke work for every ounce of wisdom he can get. You ever notice how Yoda talks? Those backward sentences that sound kind of funny? Maybe he does that on purpose, trying to make you pay attention. It's not always easy to understand what he means at first, but it makes you stop and think. That's probably the point. Even though Yoda's this legendary Jedi Master, he's dealing with a lot of doubt and pain. You can almost hear him wondering if he made the right calls, if he could have done something different to stop all the destruction. That's the reality of leadership sometimes, not having perfect answers and carrying the weight of what went wrong. If you put yourself in Yoda's shoes for a second, think about it. The galaxy's falling apart, your people are dying, and you know that charging in without a plan might only make things worse. What do? Fight or wait? It's not an easy choice. And that's probably why Yoda took the path he did, waiting on Dagobah. It's a preparation, observation, and holding on to hope when everything around you seems lost. Yoda knows that rushing back into the galaxy's chaos would probably just lead to more death and destruction. That kind of patience takes strength. Sometimes the strongest people aren't the ones who fight the hardest, but the ones who keep going quietly when no one's watching. Yoda's survival and his decision to train Luke shaped the whole future of the galaxy. And think about how the Jedi were before all this happened. They were powerful, but maybe a bit stuck in their ways, rigid in their thinking. Yoda probably realizes that if the Jedi are going to survive, they need to change. Training Luke means more than just making a warrior. It's about starting fresh, learning from past mistakes. So when you see Yoda on screen, that calm, wise little guy, remember, he's carrying a lot more than just a walking stick. He's carrying years of loss, hard decisions, and a hope that's hard to keep alive, but refuses to die. And hey, if you ever feel overwhelmed or like everything's falling apart, maybe picture Yoda in his swamp, surrounded by mud, strange creatures, waiting for the right moment to rise again. Sometimes, just surviving and staying ready is the most important thing. What would you do if you were him? Would you have the patience to wait and prepare, or would you jump right back into the fight? When we think of Jedi, we usually picture shining knights in shining armor, defenders of peace and justice in a galaxy far, far away. They're the classic heroes, wielding lightsabers, using the Force for good, standing against the darkness. But if you take a closer look, the story isn't quite so simple. Jedi, with all their ideals and training, weren't exactly flawless champions. In fact, some might say their so-called heroism had serious cracks from the start. But what if behind the calm, serene faces and the grand battles, there's a lot of controversy about what the Jedi really stood for and how they operated? The Jedi Order had rules, strict codes, and ways of thinking that shaped every decision they made. But those rules sometimes blinded them or made them unwilling to adapt when the galaxy changed. For starters, the Jedi were supposed to be peacekeepers, but their peace often depended on control and influence. They weren't just humble monks sitting quietly in temples. They acted as generals in massive wars, diplomats wielding power, and sometimes even spies. You might wonder, is that the role of true heroes, or something closer to political agents? They were deeply tied to the Republic government and often acted on its behalf, which sometimes put their ideals at odds with the reality of war and politics. And speaking of war, Jedi are known for their lightsaber duels and battle prowess. But war was never what they wanted, at least officially. The Jedi philosophy emphasizes calm and detachment, yet in the Clone Wars, many Jedi had to put those ideals aside. Imagine having to fight and kill day after day, even if you're trained not to feel attachment or anger. How do you stay peaceful and calm when you're leading armies into battle? This tension between their peaceful ideal and wartime reality raises questions about whether their heroic image holds up under pressure. It's also important to mention the Jedi's strict code, especially regarding emotions and attachments. Jedi weren't allowed to have close personal relationships, no family or romantic ties. The idea was that attachments lead to fear and anger, which open the door to the dark side. But can someone truly be heroic if they are cut off from natural human connections? This rule often made Jedi seem cold or distant, and it put them in difficult emotional positions. Think about Anakin Skywalker. His forbidden attachment to Padme was one of the sparks that eventually led to his fall. So maybe the Jedi's strict rules, meant to protect them, actually planted seeds of tragedy. Another thing many people overlook is the Jedi's role in enforcing the Republic's will across countless planets. They were often sent to intervene in conflicts, sometimes using force to impose order, but this wasn't always peaceful or welcomed. Some planets and cultures saw the Jedi as imperial agents rather than noble guardians. That raises the question, can heroism exist if your peacekeeping feels like occupation or control to others? Were the Jedi acting as unbiased heroes, or were they a tool of political power, sometimes ignoring the voices of those they claim to protect? Also, consider the Jedi's training of younglings. From a very young age, children were taken from their families and brought to the Jedi Temple to be trained, often without much choice. They were raised with strict discipline, taught to suppress feelings, and trained for a life that demanded sacrifice and detachment. It's a lot to ask from kids, and it shows a side of the Jedi that is less about nurturing and more about molding soldiers or diplomats. Does this system sound heroic, or more like a strict, closed community that controls its members tightly? Of course, none of this is to say the Jedi were all bad. Many individual Jedi acted out of genuine compassion and courage, risking their lives to save others. But as an institution, their ideals and actions were more complicated and sometimes contradictory than the straightforward hero's image suggests. Their inability to adapt or acknowledge flaws played a huge role in their downfall. The galaxy didn't stay peaceful, and the Jedi's rigidity left them vulnerable to manipulation from within. So what do you think? Were the Jedi heroes trapped by their own ideals? Or maybe just deeply flawed beings trying to do their best in a messy galaxy? Keep that question in mind, because when we dive deeper, it gets even more interesting, and some of the choices they made feel less heroic and more tragic. Picking up from where we left off, it's worth exploring how the Jedi's sense of duty sometimes blinded them to what was really happening around them. They believed deeply in their mission to maintain peace, but peace for whom exactly? Often the Jedi saw themselves as the galaxy's protectors, but they didn't always listen carefully to the people they were trying to protect. That disconnect created a gap between their intentions and the outcomes of their actions. You might ask yourself, have you ever been so sure you were doing the right thing that you ignored obvious signs telling you otherwise? That's exactly what happened with the Jedi. They clung to their ancient code and their traditions, thinking that sticking to their way was the best way to keep order. Meanwhile, threats grew under their noses, and by the time they realized the danger, it was almost too late. The Clone Wars are a perfect example of this. The Jedi, who were once peacekeepers, suddenly became generals leading massive armies into battle. That shift changed everything. Imagine having to lead troops to war after spending years focused on calm meditation and self-control. That tension must have weighed heavily on many of them. And while they fought bravely, the war itself was a manipulation, engineered by forces far darker than they imagined. The Jedi were pawns in a larger game, yet many didn't see it coming until the galaxy was engulfed in chaos. One of the saddest parts of this story is how the Jedi failed to notice the real enemy in their midst, someone who played on their strengths and weaknesses, someone who understood their code better than they did. Darth Sidious, or Emperor Palpatine, wasn't just a villain lurking in the shadows. He was a master of patience, hiding behind the Republic's mask while pulling strings from the very beginning. The Jedi's confidence in their abilities and their rigid thinking made it hard for them to suspect that their greatest threat was right inside the system. Thinking about that, it's strange to imagine a group so skilled with the Force and so dedicated to peace could be so blind, isn't it? Maybe the Jedi's focus on tradition and strict adherence to their code left little room for questioning or adapting to new realities. When you're stuck in your ways, it's easy to miss the bigger picture, and the Jedi did just that. Another part that's rarely discussed is the Jedi's relationship with non-Force sensitive people. Jedi were exceptional, born with abilities others didn't have, which naturally set them apart. But this sometimes created a kind of elitism. Jedi saw themselves as guardians of the galaxy, but often didn't fully engage with the everyday struggles of regular beings. That distance could make them seem unapproachable or disconnected, which made it harder for them to build genuine trust. You might ask, can a protector truly protect when they are so separate from those they serve? It's a question that complicates their hero status. There's also the question of how Jedi interference affected local cultures and societies. The Order often sent Jedi to planets facing conflict or instability, and while their presence could bring order, it also sometimes disrupted traditions or forced changes that locals didn't want. Think about a group of outsiders arriving and imposing their own sense of right and wrong without fully understanding the history or values of the place. It can feel like colonization rather than protection, which is far from heroic when you consider the perspective of those affected. And finally, there's the issue of Jedi arrogance. Over centuries of training and belief in their mission, some Jedi grew confident, maybe too confident, in their role as guardians. That confidence sometimes turned into arrogance, making them dismissive of warnings or alternative viewpoints. That kind of hubris is dangerous anywhere, but especially when you're wielding power over others and shaping galactic events. Arrogance can cloud judgment and lead to mistakes that hurt not just the Jedi, but everyone around them. So when you look closely, the Jedi Order's story is filled with complexities and contradictions. They were meant to be heroes, yet their actions often had unintended consequences that complicate their legacy. What's your take on this? Does seeing these less obvious sides change how you feel about the Jedi? Sometimes the real story lies not in battles or legends, but in the everyday decisions and challenges faced behind the scenes. When we hear about the Sith, it's easy to think of them as the eternal enemies of the Jedi, dark, dangerous, and completely separate. The Sith are often seen as the ultimate villains, born from evil and hatred, but the truth isn't quite so black and white. In fact, the Sith Order owes a lot of its existence to the Jedi themselves. That might sound surprising, but if you look at the history, you'll see how the Jedi's strict control over Force knowledge and their intolerance of different beliefs actually pushed some early Force users away, eventually leading to the birth of the Sith. Imagine a time long before the Clone Wars, long before the rise of Darth Vader or Emperor Palpatine. The galaxy was filled with many groups and philosophies centered around the Force, some very different from what would become the Jedi Order. The Jedi didn't just stumble upon their way of living, they shaped it over generations, choosing what to accept and what to reject. And in doing so, they also decided who belonged and who didn't. The Force is vast, mysterious, and can be experienced in many ways. Some early Force users embraced emotions, passion, and power in ways the Jedi would later condemn. These alternative philosophies weren't necessarily evil at first. They were different perspectives on the Force, on how to live and interact with it. But the Jedi, believing their path was the only right one, began pushing these ideas out, sometimes harshly. You might wonder, what happens when a group with strong beliefs refuses to accept anyone who disagrees? History on Earth shows us that when people are excluded or persecuted for their beliefs, they often don't just disappear. Instead, they create their own communities, their own identities, sometimes growing stronger because of the very opposition they face. That's what happened with the earliest dark side practitioners. As the Jedi rejected their philosophies and exiled those who didn't fit in, these individuals retreated to the fringes of the galaxy, places far from the watchful eyes of the Jedi Council. There, they could develop their own understanding of the Force, one that embraced passion, strength, and ambition, rather than detachment and peace. This exile wasn't just about geography, but also about ideology. The Jedi's insistence on suppressing alternative Force teachings created an environment where resentment grew, and the desire for power became not just a personal choice, but a survival mechanism. When you're pushed out and labelled dangerous simply for thinking differently, it's natural to start seeing the dominant group as the enemy. The story of the Sith begins in this tension, a reaction to exclusion and suppression. They weren't born from pure hatred, but from rejection and a need to find a place where their views could thrive. It's a reminder that conflict often starts when dialogue stops, and one side refuses to understand the other. Have you ever felt like being told you're wrong for what you believe, only to dig in deeper because of it? That feeling of being cornered, needing to prove yourself. The Sith's origin is tied to that kind of human experience, just on a galactic scale. Interestingly, the early Sith weren't the dark, evil overlords we see in the movies. They were a diverse group with their own cultures, traditions, and codes. They experimented with the Force in ways that the Jedi wouldn't accept, embracing emotions, ambition, and power as natural and necessary parts of life. They sought strength not to dominate out of cruelty, but to survive and protect their own people from the Jedi's relentless control. But this rejection by the Jedi also planted the seeds of a bitter rivalry. The Sith came to see the Jedi as oppressors, rigid and blind, and they began to push back fiercely. Over time, this struggle shaped both orders. The Jedi doubled down on control and discipline, while the Sith embraced rebellion and passion, leading to the long conflict that would define much of galactic history. It's fascinating to think that the Jedi, who aimed to keep balance and peace, ended up creating the very opposition they feared most. Does that sound familiar? Sometimes the strongest reactions come not from the initial act itself, but from how it's handled afterward. So what does this tell us about belief, power, and how societies handle differences? Is pushing people out and calling them dangerous always the best way to maintain peace? The Jedi's story suggests otherwise, showing how exclusion can fuel conflict instead of preventing it. When we continue with the next part, we'll dive deeper into how the Sith developed their own identity, how their philosophies evolved in exile, and how this all led to the dark, powerful order that challenged the Jedi for centuries. We'll also explore the unintended consequences of the Jedi's actions and how history often repeats itself when fear and control dominate. After those early Force users were pushed away and forced into exile, they had space to develop something new, something that wasn't bound by the Jedi's strict codes or ideals. This was an exile and an opportunity to explore the Force in ways the Jedi never allowed, a chance to shape their own path and philosophy. The Sith didn't emerge as a single, unified group at first. They were a collection of different clans and traditions spread across remote worlds, each interpreting the Force differently. What united them was a shared rejection of the Jedi's rigid discipline, especially their denial of emotions and ambition. Instead, the Sith embraced passion, power, and individual strength as vital to truly mastering the Force. It's interesting to consider how this embrace of passion wasn't simply about cruelty or domination at the start. Many Sith believed that emotions like anger or desire could fuel growth and power if controlled properly. They saw themselves as breaking free from what they viewed as the Jedi's cold detachment. In a way, it was about reclaiming what the Jedi tried to suppress, the full spectrum of what it meant to be alive and connected to the Force. As these ideas took hold, Sith culture evolved with a strong focus on personal strength and ambition. Unlike the Jedi's communal order with shared rules, the Sith valued individual power and competition. This fostered a hierarchy built on might, cunning, and survival of the fittest. The Sith learned to wield the dark side of the Force not just for defense, but to gain advantage, control, and influence. But this evolution didn't happen overnight. The Sith had to survive in hostile environments, often hiding from Jedi patrols or Republic forces. Their exile made them secretive and suspicious, qualities that shaped their long-term strategy. Instead of open conflict, the Sith often operated from the shadows, plotting and waiting for the right moment to rise again. One might wonder how a group that started as outcasts could grow into one of the galaxy's most feared powers. The answer lies partly in their willingness to adapt, and partly in the Jedi's failures. By excluding alternative Force philosophies, rather than engaging with them, the Jedi created an us versus them mentality. The Sith weren't just fighting for power, they were fighting for survival and recognition. This ongoing conflict deeply influenced both orders. The Jedi became more rigid and fearful, doubling down on control, while the Sith embraced change, manipulation, and ambition. The tension between these approaches defined much of galactic history, a cycle of conflict that seemed almost inevitable. The unintended consequences of the Jedi's exile of dissenters didn't stop with the rise of the Sith Order. It also set a precedent for how fear and control can backfire. By trying to maintain order through suppression, the Jedi inadvertently created their greatest enemies. That dynamic isn't unique to Star Wars. History shows us many examples where fear-driven policies produce resistance movements stronger than the original threat. So, looking back, the story of the Sith's rise is as much about failure to understand and coexist as it is about raw power. The Jedi's strict control over Force teachings shut down dialogue and diversity, which might have led to a more balanced galaxy if handled differently. What's your take on this? Can you think of examples where excluding opposing views only made those views stronger? The Jedi and Sith story feels like a reminder that sometimes embracing complexity is harder but necessary for true balance. When you think about the galaxy's fate, it's clear that both orders shaped each other profoundly. The Jedi's fear and rigidity gave birth to the Sith's passion and cunning, and both became locked in a cycle that shaped the fate of countless worlds. So next time you see a lightsaber clash or hear the words "dark side," remember that behind it lies a much more complicated story. One about how power, fear, exclusion, and the need to belong can twist destinies in unexpected ways. When most people hear the name Count Dooku, they think of a traitor, a Sith Lord, a separatist leader who helped start the Clone Wars and nearly tore the galaxy apart. That's the image the Jedi held of him, and the one history repeated afterward. But if you take a step back and really look at the path that led Dooku from the Jedi Temple to the leadership of a massive political movement, things start to look different. Dooku wasn't simply a villain who turned to the dark side for power. He was someone who saw that the Republic was broken and believed it could be fixed. The tragedy is that he wasn't entirely wrong, but the way he tried to fix it opened the door for everything to fall apart. Let's start at the core of who Dooku was. He was a thinker, a critic, someone who questioned the systems around him instead of blindly accepting them. He came from nobility, from a wealthy and influential family on Sereno, but gave all that up to become a Jedi. That alone says a lot. He wanted purpose, structure, and a way to help the galaxy. And for a while, he believed the Jedi Order was that path. But over time, his faith began to wear thin. He saw how the Jedi became more loyal to the Senate than to the actual beings they were supposed to protect. He saw how bureaucracy, greed, and corruption were rotting the core of the Republic, and how the Jedi were becoming tools of that broken system. This wasn't just a sudden change. Dooku watched it happen over years, and it started to bother him deeply. He began taking more political interest, challenging decisions, questioning the influence of the Senate, and wondering whether the Jedi were doing any real good. And the more he asked questions, the more isolated he became. The Order didn't respond well to criticism, especially from within, so Dooku left, because he genuinely believed the Jedi had lost their way. He returned to Sereno, reclaimed his title as Count, and used his influence to begin organizing a movement. This is where it gets interesting, because the separatist movement wasn't originally only war, destruction, or domination. It was a reform. Systems across the galaxy were tired of being ignored by the Senate, tired of corruption, tired of watching the same wealthy core worlds benefit while everyone else suffered. Dooku gave them a voice. He brought together worlds that felt abandoned and built a coalition that demanded change. Now, of course, history remembers the Confederacy of Independent Systems as the enemy of the Republic. But what people forget is that before the Clone Wars ever started, it was a political alliance. It was about independence, self-governance, and rejecting a system that had stopped working for too many. And Dooku believed in that. He gave speeches that weren't about hate. They were about building a new system, a better one. And the truth is, a lot of people agreed with him. But this is where Palpatine enters the picture, and things get twisted. Palpatine saw Dooku's idealism as an opportunity. He needed someone to create a legitimate threat to the Republic, so he could justify taking emergency powers, centralizing authority, and reshaping the galaxy in his image. Dooku, with his vision and charisma, was the perfect tool. And Palpatine didn't need to manipulate Dooku with lies. He simply gave him the stage and let his frustration grow. Dooku wanted reform, but Palpatine wanted chaos. Dooku wanted to fix the Republic. He believed he could work from within, using the tools at his disposal, including a secret alliance with someone he thought understood the danger the Republic was in. But that alliance was a trap. While Dooku was rallying systems and creating a movement, Palpatine was preparing a war. While Dooku was forming a government, Palpatine was building both armies, the Republics and the Separatists. And when the war finally broke out, Dooku found himself not leading a revolution, but managing a disaster. And maybe here's where things started to fall apart for him. He believed in what the movement stood for, but now he had to justify violence, military campaigns, and secret plans. He went deeper into the shadows, leaned into darker methods, because he thought that maybe this was the only way to achieve the change he believed in. It became about sacrificing morality in the short term to save the Republic in the long run. Have you ever convinced yourself that a bad choice is okay if it serves a bigger goal? That's where Dooku found himself, caught between what he believed in and what he had to become to make it happen. And by the time he realized he was being used, it was already too late. But that moment, the moment he fully understood that Palpatine never intended to reform the Republic, that's where we'll pick things up in the next part. Because the tragedy of Dooku wasn't just that he left the Jedi or started a war, it's what happened after, when the thing he built was turned against him, and the ideals he once fought for were stripped away, piece by piece. By the time Dooku started to realize what was really going on, the war had already taken over. Entire worlds were now caught in the crossfire, and he wasn't organizing a peaceful reformation anymore. He was managing invasions, supervising generals, negotiating weapons deals with shady corporations, all in the name of fixing something that was probably past saving. He wasn't stupid. Dooku understood that he'd compromised, but he still believed he was holding things together just long enough to push the Republic to collapse from the inside, after which he could step in and rebuild something better. That was the dream anyway. He didn't see himself as a villain, not even then. He thought he was playing a longer game, one where the end would justify what he had to become along the way. But the problem with playing that game next to Palpatine is that you never really see the rules until you've already lost. Dooku assumed they were working toward a shared vision, that once the Republic was weak enough, they would strip it down, clear out the rot, and start fresh. What he didn't understand was that Palpatine had no intention of rebuilding anything. He wasn't planning a better future. He was crafting an empire, one that needed the Jedi destroyed and the war to feel endless, just long enough for people to beg for stability. And Dooku? He was never meant to survive that transition. He was part of the problem that Palpatine would pretend to eliminate. It probably hit Dooku piece by piece. He started to see how little he was being told, how quickly decisions were being made without him, how the war began feeding itself with no real path toward victory. He must have noticed how the Republic's military became stronger and more centralized, while the Separatists slowly turned into a tool to justify it all. He was being outplayed, and he knew it. There's this scene in the later years of the war, right before everything collapsed, where you can tell he's tired. Not physically, but mentally. He's sharper, more cold, more quiet. The speeches are gone. The ideals have faded. What remains is a man who thought he was shaping the future, but now can't tell if he even believes in it anymore. You can almost hear the questions in his mind. Was this really worth it? Did I misjudge everything? How far have I strayed from what I wanted to fix? But even then, he didn't give up. Not completely. There were still moments where he tried to steer things, still tried to keep some control. He trained apprentices like Ventress, tried to maintain diplomatic channels, tried to create long-term plans that didn't involve total annihilation. It's like part of him was still holding out hope that he could pivot back, that maybe this wasn't the end of the line. And then came the final blow, the moment where all the truth finally surfaced, too late for him to do anything about it. When Anakin Skywalker boarded the invisible hand with Obi-Wan, Dooku expected a confrontation. What he didn't expect was that Palpatine would betray him right there in front of his face. That moment, when he's on his knees, disarmed, waiting for his master to intervene and stop the execution, and nothing happens, that's when everything comes crashing down. He looks at Palpatine, realizes the plan was never real, that he was never meant to survive, that the dream he gave everything up for was gone, and all that's left is silence. He was supposed to be the architect of change, and he died as a discarded pawn. No legacy, no Republic reborn, just another name erased in the transition to Empire. And that's the real tragedy. Dooku wasn't a power-hungry villain who lost his way in the dark. He was a man who saw through the illusions of a broken system and tried to correct it. But he chose the wrong partner, underestimated the cost, and compromised too much along the way. He thought he could play the game from inside the shadows and come out clean on the other side. He never did. It's uncomfortable to witness, because it feels familiar. The road to good intentions gets messy fast, especially when you're operating in systems designed to resist change. Dooku's story matters because it shows how someone intelligent, thoughtful, even well-intentioned, can still become a villain in the eyes of history if they take too many wrong steps trying to do the right thing. And that version of the story, the complicated one, is rarely told. Maybe that's why so many still write him off. It's easier to call him a Sith Lord, move on, and focus on the heroes and villains we understand. But the uncomfortable truth is, Dooku doesn't fit neatly into either. He wasn't fully one or the other. He stood in between for too long, and by the time he chose, the outcome was already decided. When people talk about the Skywalker legacy, they usually go straight to Luke, the hero of the rebellion, the last Jedi, the one who turned Darth Vader back to the light. But there's this quiet truth in the background that doesn't get nearly enough attention. Leia Organa had the same Force potential as her brother, maybe even more. The difference is, she made a different choice. Leia wasn't trained as a Jedi, not in the way Luke was. She didn't have the robes or the lightsaber for most of her life, and she wasn't out there seeking ancient temples or lost teachings. But she didn't have to be. From the very beginning, Leia was someone who carried the weight of leadership, responsibility, and belief in something bigger than herself, all while having this enormous potential just beneath the surface. It's not hard to forget that Leia was Force sensitive. She never flaunted it, never used it as a badge of power or influence. But the moments are there, moments where her connection to the Force shaped her instincts, helped her sense things before they happened, understand people without needing words. Even before she knew who her father was, even before she knew she was Luke's twin, there was something in her, that calm, that fire, that presence, that made people follow her without hesitation. And that's the thing, right? The Force isn't always about lightning or jewels or lifting rocks. Sometimes it's about clarity, insight, and being able to carry the weight of impossible decisions. Leia was in the Senate before she was even out of her teens. She was organizing resistance movements, taking on the Empire, risking everything without hesitation, all while sensing what others couldn't always see. Do you ever wonder what it would have looked like if Leia had chosen the Jedi path fully? If she trained like Luke did, followed that path all the way through? That's a real what-if scenario, because every indication from the canon says she would have been a powerhouse. Even in the sequel trilogy, with very limited training, she demonstrated control and ability that took Luke years to develop. She could feel her son's pain across the galaxy, connect with her brother through the Force without speaking, and even reach out in her final moments to bring Ben Solo back to himself. But she didn't pursue that path because she believed her role in the galaxy was different. She chose diplomacy, leadership, and politics because they were harder in a different way. Building peace, holding fractured alliances together, trying to unify people after decades of war. That's a fight too, and one that doesn't come with medals or lightsabers. Leia knew she had the Force. She knew the power that came with it, but she also knew the galaxy didn't just need another warrior. It needed someone who could build trust, make hard compromises, and stand in the middle of chaos without giving into fear or anger. And let's be honest, that's way harder than just swinging a saber. She also had the burden of her family's legacy. Imagine finding out your biological father was Darth Vader. That's not something you can shrug off. And yet, Leia didn't let it define her. She didn't collapse under the weight of it or hide from it. She took that knowledge, absorbed it, and kept going. That takes a different kind of strength, one that isn't flashy or dramatic but incredibly real. Her ability to lead through conviction, to keep her head while others panicked, and to never back down when it mattered, all of that ties directly into her sensitivity to the Force. But unlike Luke, who went searching for purpose through ancient Jedi texts and rituals, Leia always had her purpose in front of her. People needed her right now, and she didn't have time to chase symbols. She was already making change, and she kept doing it long after the rebellion won. In the years after the Empire fell, Leia could have stepped back. She could have taken time to learn more about the Jedi, maybe even start her own training properly. But instead, she stayed in the Senate, stayed active, stayed leading. Because even in peace, the work wasn't done. She didn't see peace as a finish line, but as a fragile thing that needed constant protection. The tragedy is that so much of what she tried to protect eventually fell apart. The New Republic collapsed under its own weight, and her son turned to darkness. And even then, Leia didn't run. She didn't give up on her family or her cause. She kept going. She kept believing there was a way forward, even if it cost her everything. In the next part, we'll explore exactly how her power showed itself, in small ways, how Leia used the Force not like a Jedi, but in her own quiet, steady way. So let's talk about how Leia used the Force, because even if she didn't walk the Jedi path the way Luke did, the connection was always there. It was active, powerful, and deliberate when she needed it to be. Most people remember the moment in space during the events of the sequels, when Leia is blown out of the ship and somehow manages to pull herself back through the vacuum. It caught a lot of people off guard, mostly because they'd never seen her use the Force so directly before. But that moment, that was just the surface. The truth is Leia had trained, not as a full-time Jedi, not in robes with daily meditations and lightsaber drills, but enough to understand what she was capable of, enough to feel the Force, hear it, use it when she chose to. Luke even confirmed it. He said she was strong, stronger than him in some ways, and that her connection was undeniable. She didn't need decades of study to access it. It was just there, part of her. But she made a decision early on to stop that training. Why? Because she saw a vision, a glimpse of the future, and it showed her that if she kept going down the Jedi path, her son would suffer. That moment is huge, and honestly, it says everything about who Leia was. She wasn't afraid of power. She wasn't avoiding responsibility. She was choosing her child over her own potential, choosing to be present, to guide him, to try and shape his future in a way that didn't revolve around the kind of legacy that had consumed her father. Now you can look at that and say, maybe she should have finished her training, maybe that would have helped save Ben from falling. But think about it. How many people do you know who would willingly step away from something that big, something that could make them powerful, because they believed it was the right thing to do for someone else? That takes more discipline than chasing the title of Jedi Master ever could. And she never really stopped using the Force. She just did it in her own way, in conversations, in diplomacy, in moments where her presence seemed to calm a room or turn tension into cooperation. That was her power working. Leia wasn't there to perform. She didn't need to show off. Her focus was always on the outcome, not the recognition. Even during the worst moments of the Resistance, when everything was falling apart and there were barely any ships or soldiers left, Leia held it together. The First Order was rising. The Republic had collapsed again, and she was standing on the bridge of a small cruiser, still leading, still believing. And through it all, you get the sense that she was holding something together that most people couldn't even see. Not just strategy or morale, but a kind of spiritual center. That quiet pull that reminded people of what they were fighting for. Leia's presence had weight. People felt her. When she entered a room, the air changed. That's not just leadership. That's the Force. That's what made her different. She didn't need to raise her voice or pull out a saber. Her strength came from the way she carried every battle, every sacrifice, every impossible decision, without losing her center. She also lived through more pain than most characters in the saga, and never lost herself in it. She lost Alderaan, lost her parents, lost Han, lost her son, lost countless friends in the war, and still she showed up, every time. That kind of resilience doesn't come from training manuals or combat forms. It comes from something deeper. And again, that's the Force too. The ability to keep going, to adapt, to believe when everything says not to. When people talk about Jedi power, they usually go straight to combat. But Leia quietly showed us another side of it. Patience, empathy, endurance. She wasn't concerned with tradition. She wasn't chasing destiny. She just did what needed to be done. And even when she finally passed, she didn't fade with anger or regret. She used her last moments to reach her son, one last time. She reached him not through violence, not with confrontation, but with connection. That was always her way. That was her strength. So yeah, Leia could have been the strongest Jedi of her time if she had chosen to be. That potential was there. The Force wasn't holding her back. She was holding back. Because she knew power wasn't the answer the galaxy needed from her. What it needed was someone who could lead without ego, love without fear, and sacrifice without needing the spotlight. And maybe that's what makes her legacy so powerful. She didn't try to live up to anyone else's story. She didn't try to replicate what the Jedi used to be. She understood her role, made her choices, and left behind something that can't be measured in titles or lightsabers. So we all remember that scene in A New Hope. Luke returns home, sees smoke in the distance, and finds the Lars homestead burning, with 2 charred skeletons lying out front. It's one of the darkest moments in the entire original trilogy, and to this day, it's still jarring. The official line? Stormtroopers did it. They were tracking the droids, came to the farm, didn't find what they wanted, and decided to torch the place. That's the version most people accept, because that's what the story told us in the moment. But if you stop and look a little closer, really think about what's being shown and how it fits into the rest of what we know, something starts to feel off. Stormtroopers are brutal, sure, but they're also known for working as a unit. They destroy, they shoot, they execute orders, but burning 2 civilians alive outside their home? That's not really standard Imperial protocol. It's not efficient, it's not clean, and it sends the wrong kind of message. And leaving behind 2 burnt bodies like that, it feels personal, it feels targeted, like someone was sent to make a statement. And here's where Boba Fett comes into the picture. At this point in the timeline, the Empire is already starting to turn to bounty hunters for more surgical work when they need someone tracked, found, or taken out quietly. Fett was already on their radar. He was known for getting jobs done fast, clean, and without questions. So, the theory goes like this. When the droids went missing with the Death Star plans, the Empire didn't just send stormtroopers. They sent Fett ahead of them to scout out any local connections. His job? Find the source, remove anyone who might interfere, and leave no witnesses. If you're the Empire, and you know these droids were last seen on Tatooine, and someone's helping them stay hidden, are you really just relying on sandtroopers riding dewbacks to check in on every farmer? Or are you using someone faster, smarter, and way more dangerous to get ahead of it? Boba Fett wouldn't kick down the front door with a squad. He'd show up alone, watch from a distance, figure out who's involved, and move quickly. He wouldn't waste time interrogating Owen and Beru. If he figured out they were covering for someone, he'd end it then and there. He wasn't known for patience. If you stood in the way, you were a problem. And to him, a problem was something to eliminate. Now think about the way the bodies were found. Fully burned, outside the home. Not even an attempt to hide what happened. Stormtroopers wouldn't go to that trouble. They'd either arrest you, shoot you, or leave a burned down building behind. This was different. This looked like someone set an example. This is what happens if you help the wrong people. And that kind of message, that feels like Fett's style. And remember, Tatooine wasn't just any backwater planet. Fett knew it well. He operated out of there regularly, worked with Jabba the Hutt, and had eyes and ears all over the place. So if word got around that 2 droids carrying something valuable were picked up by a local boy, it wouldn't take long for Fett to piece it together. Owen and Beru didn't have a long history of getting involved in anything big, but they had one major connection. They were raising Luke Skywalker, even if they weren't using the name openly. And here's where it gets even more interesting, because there's always been this question around whether the Empire knew about Luke's identity. Some say Vader didn't realize who Luke was until after the Death Star blew up, but others believe Palpatine had suspicions early on, and the Empire was quietly watching certain individuals. The other detail people miss is that Fett doesn't leave a trail. That's his thing. He gets in, gets out, and nobody knows it was him. If he was the one who handled Owen and Beru, it would explain why there's no follow-up. No scene with the Empire reporting it. No stormtrooper bragging about it. Just silence, because as far as the official record goes, the deaths were part of a cleanup. No one would think twice, and that's exactly what you'd want if you were using a bounty hunter to do your dirty work. So let's lay it out. The Empire was chasing stolen plans, they needed fast results, and they didn't trust local garrisons to handle it. Fett was already someone they used for high-value targets, and he was local. Sending him to handle the Lars situation makes tactical sense. And the brutal surgical way it was carried out, that lines up with Fett's methods, not standard stormtrooper behavior. The moment Snoke appeared in The Force Awakens, fans were locked in. Something about him felt older, stranger, deeper, like this wasn't the beginning of his story at all, like we were seeing the tail end of something that had been lurking in the background for years, maybe decades. And almost instantly, one name started circling again. Darth Plagueis. You probably remember the way Palpatine first mentioned him, the opera scene. Quiet voice, slow pacing, like he was peeling back something personal. He practically handed him a key to the dark side. wrapped in mystery. Darth Plagueis the Wise, the Sith who could cheat death, who manipulated midichlorians, who was eventually betrayed by his own apprentice. The thing is, Star Wars doesn't throw lines like that into movies for no reason. It planted something, and it never quite answered it. And then Snoke shows up. Scarred face, ancient-sounding voice, powerful in the Force, with knowledge of both Jedi and Sith, and pulling strings from the shadows across the galaxy. So the theory started. What if Darth Plagueis never died? What if he survived his apprentice's betrayal? What if Snoke was him? And if you think about it, there's room for that idea. Plagueis was obsessed with conquering death. He didn't care about armies or politics as much as he cared about life itself, reshaping it, extending it. If someone was going to figure out a way to survive a murder attempt, especially by someone as predictable as Palpatine, it would be him. And if he came back, changed, broken, twisted but alive, what would he become? That's where Snoke could fit in. He's not your usual Sith, he doesn't follow the rule of two. He doesn't even take the Darth title, but he talks like someone who's been around a long time. He talks like he's seen empires rise and fall, like he understands how the light and dark sides move through history. And he didn't come out of nowhere. He was watching, waiting, pulling Ben Solo toward the dark from a distance. So the theory makes some sense. A powerful ancient Force user who doesn't die when he's supposed to, who vanishes and returns decades later under a new name, operating from the shadows. It's the classic Sith playbook, just updated for a new era. And Palpatine never says how, exactly, he killed Plagueis, only that it was in his sleep. That's the kind of vague story that begs to be questioned, but the official canon doesn't confirm it. The sequel trilogy later leans in a different direction, that Snoke was a clone or some kind of artificial being created by Palpatine to act as a puppet. That's the explanation we got. And sure, that closes the door on the Plagueis theory a bit, but not completely. Because Palpatine never creates things from nothing. He reuses what exists. He twists it, corrupts it, reshapes it to serve his goals. So what if Snoke wasn't Plagueis directly, but made from him? A clone maybe, or a genetic experiment built using remains, or fragments of Plagueis' essence. There's precedent for this. Sith have been experimenting with cloning and dark science for centuries. Palpatine himself survived death through cloning. He was clearly obsessed with preserving his legacy through unnatural means. And if that's true, it raises new questions. Did Palpatine fully control Snoke? Or did Snoke develop a mind of his own? Did he inherit Plagueis' knowledge, or just pieces of it? Why would he be allowed to gain so much power if he was only meant to be a tool? The weird part is that Snoke doesn't act like a puppet. He has his own personality, his own style of manipulation. He taunts Kylo Ren, praises Rey, dismisses Hux. That doesn't feel like a mindless creation. That feels like someone with history. Someone who knows how to lead, how to pressure people, how to shape an outcome. It's hard to believe that's just random programming. And the design of his character, even visually, screams ancient. Tall, frail, deformed, like someone who's been through 100 lifetimes. He isn't like Palpatine, who hides behind a mask of authority. Snoke wears his wounds on the outside. He wants to be seen. He wants people to feel uncomfortable in his presence. So if he isn't Plagueis, then who the hell is he? So let's untangle what we actually know about Snoke, starting with the facts that the sequel trilogy gave us. And yeah, there aren't many. But what we do get is weird, vague, and clearly designed to leave room for interpretation, which is exactly why people are still debating this guy years later. Snoke wasn't born into the galaxy like a regular person. He was engineered, created by the Sith Eternal cultists loyal to Palpatine. That's the official word. In The Rise of Skywalker, we get that quick scene on Exegol. Vats filled with failed clone bodies, strange, deformed duplicates, and then there's Snoke floating inside one of them. It tells us he wasn't organic in the normal sense. He was manufactured. But here's where it gets weird. If Snoke was just a meat puppet, why does he talk and act like someone with real authority? Why does he have force powers that rival a Jedi Master? Why is he able to manipulate Kylo Ren from across the galaxy? You can't just inject that kind of power into a test tube and expect it to act independently. Something else had to be mixed into that creation. Something ancient, something real. And that's where people start circling back to the idea of essence transfer, Sith spirits, lingering consciousness. The Sith had a long history of messing with immortality. Darth Bane, Exar Kun, Palpatine himself. They all toyed with the idea of surviving death through unnatural means. Not just through cloning, but by literally anchoring their souls to objects, places, or even other bodies. And if Palpatine could do it, it's fair to ask, could Snoke have been a vessel for a Sith spirit, or a combination of multiple old dark side users? Let's think about Plagueis again for a second. If Palpatine killed him in his sleep, but Plagueis had spent years studying how to cheat death, what are the odds he left some kind of failsafe? A ritual, a backup plan? Maybe a fragment of consciousness stored away, waiting for a host. Something like that doesn't even need to be fully conscious at first. It could resurface over time, adapting, growing, waiting for the right body. What if Snoke was that body? Even if Plagueis wasn't fully alive inside Snoke, maybe part of him was. Maybe that's why Snoke feels so ancient, so self-assured, so different from a clone that was just grown to take orders. There's an intelligence there, a knowledge of Jedi and Sith history that seems too informed to be just fabricated by some Sith cultists playing God in a lab. But here's where the whole thing flips, because despite how powerful Snoke seemed, he was disposable. Palpatine let him get cut in half. No safety net, no backup plan, just gone. Like he served a purpose, and once that was done, he was trash. So either Snoke really was just a temporary face for the Empire's return, or he was starting to think for himself, and Palpatine didn't like that. You ever wonder about that moment? Because Snoke was training Kylo Ren to be the next supreme leader, pushing him toward full control, even talking about how he'd complete Vader's legacy. But Palpatine had his own plan for Ben Solo. He wanted him on Exegol as part of his own rebirth. So, if Snoke had his own ideas, maybe he wasn't as controlled as people assumed. Maybe that's why Palpatine didn't stop Rey and Kylo when they turned on Snoke. Maybe it was all convenient. The bigger question though, if Snoke wasn't Plagueis and wasn't fully independent, then what was the point of making him at all? Why not just have Palpatine show up in The Force Awakens and skip the middleman? That's where the theory holds weight again, because Snoke gave the galaxy a break from Palpatine. He created confusion. He reset the narrative. He was the mask that let evil re-enter the room without people realizing it. And here's the twist that doesn't get talked about much. Snoke might have believed he was in charge. That's the scary part. If you give someone power, knowledge, control, and don't tell them they're a pawn, they might just start playing the game like they matter. Snoke may have developed a sense of identity, even if he was technically engineered. And once that happened, there was no going back. He trained Kylo, challenged the Resistance, shattered the Jedi legacy, all before we even found out who he really was. And by the time we did, he was dead. And Palpatine was back on stage again, like nothing had happened. That's what makes the whole Snoke mystery so weird. He mattered enough to change everything, but not enough to survive his own plan. So who was he? A clone, yeah, a puppet probably, but also a symbol of how deep the Sith's manipulation ran, how long Palpatine had been planning, and how little the galaxy really understood about what was happening beneath the surface. Snoke was a lie, but he was a convincing one, and sometimes that's all you need to rewrite history. When you really step back and look at it, Star Wars theories are less about getting the right answer, and more about what they reveal, about the universe, about the characters, and honestly, about us. The reason people spend years digging into background lore, speculating on Palpatine's secret plans, rethinking Yoda's choices, or wondering what Leia could have become, isn't just because they want to be right. It's because the story left room to ask those questions in the first place. That's something Star Wars does better than most stories. It's got these gaps, intentional or not, these little moments where the camera moves on too quickly, or where the history doesn't fully add up, or where a character's motivations seem off unless you really stop and look closer. And that's where theories live. Not in rewriting the story, but in zooming into the parts that maybe weren't finished yet. Fans want to understand how the galaxy got to where it is, why a Jedi would fall, why a clone would turn, why a character we thought we knew made the choices they made. And since the saga spans thousands of years, multiple generations, and dozens of conflicting perspectives, there's always room to ask, what if? That curiosity is a big part of what keeps Star Wars alive, especially in the gaps between movies or shows. You watch The Phantom Menace again, and suddenly Dooku feels different after knowing more about him. You hear Palpatine mention Plagueis, and realize how little we actually know about that story. You see Luke throw away the lightsaber in The Last Jedi, and it makes you wonder, what was going through his mind all those years before? Theories give those moments weight. They give fans something to connect to challenge, to argue about in a good way. And over time, they become part of the experience. They don't replace canon, but they run alongside it, and sometimes they even predict it before it's official. Some theories go nowhere, some end up half-true, and some completely miss the mark, but that's fine. The point isn't to win at speculation. The point is to explore, to keep thinking, keep questioning, keep imagining what's possible in a galaxy that was always meant to feel bigger than the frame you're given, and maybe more importantly, to connect with others who are asking the same questions. That's why people still debate whether Mace Windu survived, or if Anakin was really the chosen one, or what bringing balance actually meant. Not because those theories need answers, but because they give us a reason to care again, a reason to go back, rewatch, reread, and see things from a different angle. In the end, Star Wars theories are just conversations. Long, scattered, creative, messy conversations. And that's kind of the best part. Because once you stop theorizing, once you stop wondering what if, the story stops growing. And in Star Wars, the story has always been more than just what's on screen. It's what happens when people keep asking questions.